Thank you, Vivek. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. So आज हम डिस्कस करेंगे कैंसर रिसर्च एंड रिसर्च फंडिंग के बारे में. एंड टू डिस्कस दिस आज हमारे पास काफी एमिनेंट लोग हैं. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल आई वुड लाइक टू इनवाइट डॉक्टर राकेश जलाली सर. Sir is one of the most well-known radiation oncologists not only in the country but globally. He is an authority in CNS tumors and he leads the Apollo Proton Cancer Center. So, Jalali sir, welcome.
Thank you.
Next is my friend Dr. Santam Chakraborty. I have hardly seen anyone who is as intelligent as Santam, be it patient care, be it statistics, with understanding of the issues. So, welcome, Santam. Santam is a senior radiation oncologist from TMC Kolkata.
Thank you, Vijay.
Next is Dr. Sewanti Limaye. Madam has finished training from US, and after that she has been working in India, Mumbai since last 10 years. Has a wealthy experience in research and even in practice, and she is one of the very eminent molecular oncologists of the country. So welcome, Dr. Sewanti ma'am. And the last is a dear friend of mine, Dr. Venkat Radhakrishnan. Dr. Venkat Radhakrishnan has done a lot of research in pediatric cancers. One of the highest publications in pediatric cancers come from India, and that's frankly contributed by Dr. Venkat after Dr. Samir Bakshi. So, welcome Venkat, and he is the head of the department of the Cancer Institute at India Medical Oncology Department.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay.
Yeah, so with that, we'll start the session, and I have put questions which are fundamentally which most of us discuss. In very few limited meetings we discuss about these issues, but today we have people from government background, funding background, your patient advocacy group. So let's hope that something comes out of it. So the disclaimer would be that all discussions today are related to investigator-initiated trials and not related to pharma research. So for the understanding of all the people who are hearing, Venkat, can you tell us the differentiation between pharma and investigator-initiated trial, and why investigator-initiated trial are important?
As the name suggests, Dr. Vijay, investigator-initiated trials are initiated by individuals for doing research. Unlike pharma, these trials are not for regulatory approval. That is, they are not for selling a new drug, or marketing a new drug. They are more for understanding science or getting to know about something new. So an investigator-initiated trial cannot be used to sell, to get approval by the government of India, or to get sell the drug in the market, unlike a pharma-initiated trial. This can be done by individuals even in small hospitals. You don't have to be in an academic center. You can be in a corporate hospital and do an investigator-initiated trial.
What is the difference in funding between a pharma-initiated trial and investigator-initiated? How does investigator-initiated trial get funding?
Pharma-initiated trial, the funding is provided by the sponsor, which is typically the pharma company. They are business organizations, so they have the money to fund the trial. Whereas investigator-initiated trial, funding can be through various sources. It can be in the organization you're working, like Cancer Institute or Tata Memorial. It can be from philanthropic donors. It can be through government funding through, DBT schemes or DST schemes. So there are various sources of funding for investigator-initiated trials, but pharma is by the company, or it's a business who is doing the study.
So I'll come to Santam. Santam, why do you think when already pharma is doing research, or these giants are doing research, why do we need investigator-initiated research?
So the primary reason why investigator-initiated trials is required is because these trials are actually done by people who are in the front lines. Most importantly, pharma-sponsored research is necessarily and always motivated by drug development in a particular area. The primary motivation of the pharmaceutical company is to generate profit for its shareholders. It has no allegiance to patient care. On the other hand, investigators who will be primarily clinicians have allegiance primarily to patient care. And that is why it is well known that pharma-sponsored trials are classically going to be the positive trials. They will often be designed in such a manner that the results turn positive. Investigator-initiated trials, on the other hand, will look at results which are clinically meaningful, which will probably result in outcomes that really matter to the patient. And in this area, I think pharmaceutical sponsored trials can never come in. There is also another area that not all cancer care is pharmaceuticals, right? I am a radiation oncologist, and radiation oncology trials and even surgical oncology trials cannot be industry driven with a few exceptions. And here, majority of the research and the advancement is actually driven by dedicated clinician scientists who are actually interested in making the lives of their patients better.
Okay. That's a good point, Shantam. So coming to Jalali sir, sir, basic question. There are many patients hearing it. Do we need research or we don't need research at all? Because whenever you talk to patient about research, it is a kind of a negative perception in patient population that okay, research means oh they are going to use us like guinea pig, or this is a common perception even though patient doesn't tell us. So why is research necessary?
A very good question, Vijay, and it also reflects the societal pattern of a particular region, and especially in lower income countries, including in India. But research is absolutely critical because we don't need to, reinvent the wheel. Any medical advance can come only from study. Research does not necessarily mean always a phase 3 randomized trial. It can be a simple outcome study, it can be a retrospective study, but properly designed, statistically powered, and any intervention, whether it is investigated, initiated, and as many people said, instead of pharma, we should probably use the word industry because industry is there as well. And the third point, Vijay, also you should be the multicentric cooperative studies. So there are several, I actually put 3 buckets of the research. One is investigator initiated, one is industry purely sponsored, and third is, for example, a very big breast trial, which may be externally supported partly by industry, partly by health. It can be a TORTC study, it can be an NRG study, it can be an ICON study, it can be the pediatric hematology oncology, the INPOC study. So those also should be borne in mind. But the fundamental question is, and we have written about it actually in JAMA a few years ago, why research is important. Now, in our country, actually, people like you, me, Venkat, Shantam, everyone, we are in a very unenviable position. We are in a very difficult position. We have this optimal balance of doing just simple practice because of the sheer number of patients that we see is enormous. And also the resources are relatively limited. And then, as you rightly said, the environment is not conducive for research, both from the hospitals or the centers that we work in, and also the patient and caregiver and advocacy groups as well. On the other hand, many of us feel so conscious that we have such a large number of patients, you have the right expertise. It is a matter of putting things together and you can generate world-class data, like some of you have already demonstrated. So how to achieve this balance is the challenge that we have in our country, and we can talk about it. But fundamentally, research helps us to further advance, and it can be a simple research. It can be just, for example, you have shown that low-dose immunotherapy. Now, no pharma study is going to sponsor that study. Epidemiological study, patient-reported outcome study, quality of life study, demographic study, molecular genetic study. These are all very relevant research because you need to know the milieu of your patient population, and that is very important. Very important point, which Venkat will actually bear with me, is the percentage of abandonment. There is a huge number of patients in our country, especially pediatric adults, but also in adult, where there is an abandonment. There has been tons of data, including coming from our own country. Whenever you put the patients in clinical trials, it may not be like the most elegant research study, but you have the ways. There is a trial coordinator, you get the medical social worker involved, there is a follow-up there, whether it is virtual, whether it is actual, physical, and there is a percentage of abandonment has reduced dramatically when you put them in the clinical trials. There is also tons of evidence also available that when patients are in clinical trials, their outcome seems to be slightly better than as compared to the general public. So every single factor actually is in favor of research. Fortunately, in my own career in the last 20, 30 years, I have seen a dramatic change in the receptivity of people and patient advocates also towards research. While there are still some hurdles on it, but it is all of us, it's our unanimous duty to overcome these hurdles and try to engage people and communities into appropriate your own environmental based research so that we can cater to our patient populations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. So what we wanted to make a point here is that research is absolutely important. Without research, we cannot have development and outcomes. That outcomes won't improve. We would be just there decades behind if we don't do research and just do clinical practice. Now, when we talk about research, one of the main thing and the challenge in India, it's funding. And I'll ask this question to each one of you. Do you ever get it? Is it easy? And if you get it, all components accounted for, like adverse event management and compensation. And I'll start from Dr. Venkat. We'll then go to Dr. Santam and last to Dr. Jalali for the final words. So Dr. Venkat.
Funding is difficult. It's like the Aladdin's lamp. So sometimes I don't even think about applying for funding. I try to do things which are available within the hospital, standard of care studies, which can be paid by your Ayushman Bharat or this thing. Because sometimes you might end up waiting 5-6 years for funding and your idea becomes obsolete. Yes, there are some funding which can occur, which comes very quickly, especially from professional organizations like ASCO, ASH, but they're not enough to cover all your spending. So the first thing, before you might have a grand idea, but you have to think how you're going to pay for it. If it's too much, then I don't think so you should jump into it without trying to arrange for funding. So that's what I would say. It's not easy. It's very difficult.
Okay, one question. Out of 10 proposals you put, how many you get funding for?
One.
Okay. Okay. And how much funding has come from ICMR or DBT, DST up till now? How many projects?
So none from none of my projects, but as part of a collaborative icicle, we got funding from one of the government agency, which was again removed after 1 year. They promised for 3 years, we got for 1 year only. So I don't want to name the agency.
Okay. Santam?
Yeah, I agree. Funding is a huge challenge for us. Speaking from practical experience, I have sort of submitted 2 grant proposals which came through in DBT and ICMR. The DBT one was for a device development. It was something that I submitted before in the COVID. The funding was approved. I am still waiting for the funding to arrive. So that's a huge thing. Even if the funding is approved, the time it takes for the money to come is abysmally pathetic. The other trial, that is the ICMR trial, actually did not fund for a required investigation in the trial, which was really surprising considering the reviewers actually insisted to introduce that investigation into the clinical trial protocol. And subsequently, the funding agency decided not to fund for it. So that was really amazing. So definitely, if you ask the question whether every component is accountable, it is certainly not. It means clinical trials in India run on shoestring budget. And I am happy to share that just yesterday, we went through an IRB proposal where we will be conducting a small survey to actually understand the ground realities of this funding in a little bit better manner. But I am pretty sure about the results. If we look at the available data from one publication which was done 5-6 years ago by Dandona et al., I calculated per trial research funding comes out to around 10 lakhs or 15 lakhs on average, which is nothing when you compare it to the actual cost of running a clinical trial. So I'm pretty sure the vast majority of the people who are actually running clinical trials are doing it simply on the basis of the funds which are available from external sources.
Jalali, sir?
Funding is a huge issue, as rightly said. However, I'm not so pessimistic though. There are various ways you can do it. There are essentially 4 or 5 sources of funding. One is the institutional funding. In Tata Memorial Centers, of course, we are hugely benefited by the DAE Research Fund, and all of us have benefited from that. Sometimes it is harder because it is quite competitive. But you also should look at the type of funding that you apply for. If it is an investigational drug, then obviously it is difficult. But you should also look at collecting 2 or 3 trials and getting a human resource. One of the issues in the trial running is just getting a data manager or getting a statistician on board or getting the follow-ups correctly done. So that is one part. The ICMR, DBT, DST, and so on and so forth, absolutely correct, absolutely difficult, almost never we have managed from the clinical oncology perspective. But the problem is that these are essentially only funding agencies for whatever basic and translational scientists are there in the country. So it is not impossible to do it. In fact, I have been on the committees few times on DBT, and it has been always said that we hardly get any quality clinical trials, and they would love to fund it, although our experience is slightly different. My advice is to make, Vijay, I love your slides always when you talk about it, right people. So if you make friends with the totally aligned, but do put some basic and translational aspect, there will be some better funding. It may not be consistently, but at least the seed money and some aspect could be done. Now, we are handicapped in India, for example, taking this example of North America, where the AACR, the basic science research from the institution, from the national capital, but also the individual hospitals like Memorial or MD Anderson or Duke and so on and so forth. But the National Cancer Institutes have the basic fundamental funding from the NCI, but also the clinical research is conducted by the several cooperative groups like NRG and so on and so forth. That we lack in India. So the government funding is not there for the clinical trials and clinical research. There could be a basic and translational research. So it is the onus is on clinicians like us while we spend some time on it. But if we can do, like we do patient advocacy, we must also do a clinical trial advocacy and try to extract some money from the government on that. The third source of funding is philanthropy, which we have not tapped so well in India. And there are obvious reasons, because whenever you go to research, and this is a perfect platform because we have very passionate and dynamic patient advocates, and our humble plea to them is to also try to motivate the philanthropic concept, not only to put, they will say, okay, I will take care of 15 children with whatever cancer or leukemias. But if we are smart enough and put them in the clinical trial, it can be a prospective database, which is fine, and looking at a relatively simple research question, they would not mind. And that can be done. And I can give you an example. Venkat would agree with me, what a marvelous support we had from Vinay Jain's Limaye Foundation. So they did fund clinical trials, but for a decade, they funded 3 or 4 human resource to every cancer center in the country. And I myself in neuro-oncology, we were benefited from it. The key, however, is also to show to them we are using those resources optimally. So proper presentations, timely publications, making an effort and show will attract the funding. And lastly, we should not dismiss pharma and industry like that. You have to be smart to use that money also to train your human resource, to go to the clinical trial methodology, how to pass the IRB, because they are voluminous consent forms, and it's a very good learning process. I always tell them, all my younger colleagues, is that be smart, take 3 or 4 buckets. It could be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, or it could be 50% investigation, 25% large cooperative group where your external, where your name may come in a footprint, but doesn't matter as long as it comes in a major journal, and you will fortunately attract then philanthropy and other sources. And also look at the patient advocacy and industry also smartly, because they will fund you at least the human resource.
I agree with you, sir. Most of us would be doing that. We have some pharma resource, and with the pharma resource, we try to manage the other trial also. We pull in resource between 2 or 3 trials and try to manage. My humble request to ICMR is, ICMR somehow keeps coming through these adventurous guidelines for clinical trial research, and they would talk about very heavy adverse event management utilities, compensation laws, which are actually applicable to pharma studies, but these would get applicable to investigative trials. I'm okay with this, but when you get funding from ICMR itself, ICMR doesn't pay for the compensation laws. I don't know what kind of body we are. We make the laws, but we say that we are not going to fund for it, which actually defeats the purpose of making the law. It actually hampers doing any research. The second thing which you point out is very nice, philanthropy. In fact, the low dose trial was supported by one such philanthropic organization run by one of the patients, and I've learned it from you, from the Brain Tumor Foundation of India. In fact, I have been recipient of more funds from Tata than Tata have received it from the Brain Tumor Foundation of India. So I think it's important that we tap this. Another important source which we don't tap according to me is the CSR fund, the Corporate Social Responsibility Fund. Somehow these funds, they get activated somewhere around February and March when the year is going to end, and they end up like, we will support for this many patients, for this many nutrition, or this many robotic procedure. I think we need to be smart enough to see that this fund actually is utilized for studies, because then that fund doesn't touches 15 or 20 patients, but it touches at least 2,000 or 3,000 of the patients. With that, we move to the next things. Sources of research funding, we won't discuss that. Dr. Jalali sir has nicely put up what sources we have. Now, institutional fund is an important fund, and all four of us have been worked in institute. Some of us are still working in institute. Is it true that if you have ICMR fund, DBT fund, or DST fund, these are issued by a few institutes? Not all institutes receive it. And let's have frank answers. And I'll start here from Jalali sir.
Absolutely right. I mean, there is an inherent bias in it. I have now working in 5 years in the private corporate structure, and although we have done in our own humble manner, right from day one, we have a clinical research secretariat. We have 15 ongoing clinical trials, 12 or 13 are investigated, and 4 are industry sponsored. And we have now made a central research unit from the Proton Cancer Center. It's called Autopsy Ready Research Unit. But we have tried to fund, even COVID time, Apollo tried to fund, and absolutely right, there was a barrier. This barrier of a certain institute, I'm giving you the point of private versus corporate versus government. But within the government also there are biases, and it is universal, you can't help it. It comes from a major premier institute versus a small university hospital in the US or Europe would be the same. I would also go one step further. It also is driven by the branch. Now, for example, current flavor is immuno-oncology or CAR T cell therapy. It is obviously much easier to do that rather than you will tell someone, okay, I'm going to do a phase 1, just an exploratory drug trial based on some completely different subject. So that also has to be done. But at the same time, these are the nuances of research, and I always believe timing is critical. What trial to do when also is important from the smartness. There are supposedly objective criteria. They are supposed to be blinded. The institution's names and the investigator names are not supposed to be seen on by the referees. And I mean, we are a public forum, so probably it is done fairly, but you do get this sense, frankly, that sometimes they are not so objective as one would hope for. But I feel it is getting better. As I said, I'm more optimistic in that as every year, every 5 years, every 10 years, especially oncology, with the global kind of power that we have generated with the clinical trials and several of them practice changing, the whole world, and including the Indian funding agencies, will have to look very carefully before awarding. In the past, it was almost impossible to get such kind of funding. So while there are certainly all those 4 points are absolutely right, the branches, the clinical science, or the topical flavor of the season or of the year, but I think it will get a little bit better over a period of time, hopefully.
Shantam, do you think radiation oncology trials are not easily funded?
Yes, of course. Radiation oncology trials are immensely challenging to get fundings for. As Dr. Jalali has mentioned, it is really problematic. Means if you want to do a pure clinical oncology trial where radiation is one of the major components, like we are planning a prophylactic para-aortic radiation trial, we got a funding of around 35 lakhs. At the basic minimum, proper funding for this trial would cost us in the very minimum around 2 to 3 crores to run. This is excluding the cost of any kind of equipment purchase, because no equipment purchase is being planned. Okay. But on a proper scale, if you want to plan this and have funding for everything, including adverse effects, compensation for injuries as per requirement, it's nearly impossible to conduct. So definitely the radiation oncology faces a huge challenge in funding. And this is not only true for India, this is actually true globally. And the share of pie for radiation oncology research is shrinking as the decades pass. And unfortunately, currently, as per the recent, I believe there was a publication in JAMA, which showed the overall global radiation oncology research accounts for around only 5% of the total research funding available.
Venkat, I have a slightly different question for you. My question is, for doing a trial, for doing an investigation, do you get paid?
No, I don't get paid.
No, this is an important point I wanted to brought about. Like Dr. Santam pointed out, Dr. Jalali pointed out, Dr. Venkat is also pointing this out. In India, to do research, investigator-initiated research, there are no, what you could say, incentives, except that it is for the helping of the patient. And because there are patient advocacy groups, I actually wanted to bring this point out that neither of the investigators nor the institute gets paid for doing this research. This research is done completely with the with what you say bhavna in Hindi, that yes, we want to do something better for the patients, and doing this research will lead to an improvement in our patient outcomes. We move on to the next. Okay, now this things we have actually discussed. When we get funding from the government, this funding suddenly gets curtailed. So my question is, when you get this such fundings gets curtailed, I'll actually share my experience. I was for reverse swing, we had got ICMR funding, and during COVID, it suddenly got curtailed. But there were patients who were taking mebendazole, and I had to pay 1.5 lakhs nearly from my pocket to get that mebendazole, because patients were doing well and we couldn't do anything. But this was mebendazole, so I could manage. My question is, what you would do if suddenly the funding gets curtailed, and how it throws off the research completely out of there? Venkat, we'll start from you this time.
It happened to us at a lot of other centers in the ICICL trial when ICMR suddenly withdrew the funding, and we are left with data managers whom we couldn't pay, and it was really a struggle, and we had to approach donors, NGOs. I had to beg and plead with my hospital admin saying that we can't abandon our patients, we can't abandon the trial. And then I had some donor who gave me money, and my hospital was thankfully willing to support the funding. So we ended up taking over what ICMR had to do. But it wasn't easy for everybody. It was stressful for all of us. So yes, I hope it shouldn't happen to anybody.
Yeah, Shantam, this is a question to you also. If we don't have fundings, and I remember that we get calls from ICMR each year, don't you think it's better that we complete the research for which we had promised funding than asking for calls each year?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Vijay. Funding being made available for a trial and then being withdrawn is actually criminal, I would say. It is unethical, because it's at the end, the clinical trials are being done on human subjects. And people who are consenting have consented for a treatment or an intervention, thinking that this would be provided. If the funding agency is not capable of supporting this trial in the long run, it should not make commitments for that.
So what you would advise, because all out of all four of us, you are the one who have sat on this committees the most. What should be our advice to ICMR or DVST regarding these things? Because this is a problem, and year and after year, I know colleagues in which the funding suddenly gets dropped. The PhD fellows, money cannot be given. You have already ordered the reagent, but you cannot process with the experiment. This is what happens on the biological side. Clinician side, it is disaster, because patients are already on the treatment, and suddenly the drug disappears. Then it's a big loss of face for the doctor and overall for the community to talk about research.
Are you asking me?
Yes, sir, to you.
No, it is very sad. I have experienced myself, and this cannot happen. And Shant is actually absolutely right. It is unethical to let it happen. From any parameter, any yards to take, it cannot happen. And as you rightly said, I have colleagues from Indian Institute of Science, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. You know, the senior research fellows or the junior research fellows, all of us know the meager salaries that they have, and they don't have any external source, and suddenly the salaries are not happening for months, and they are tenure posts. They are not like a full blown post, and they are only for 2 years or 3 years, and then have to reapply. That is why, sadly, actually, we are losing some of the great talent to industry, because including, we were always thinking clinical scientists, but also the basic scientists. And all of us know, even the recent advances, people are setting up their own companies, and this is very sad, cannot happen. Now, this happens sometimes in the West also, by the way. And what West has done are two things. One is empowered as compared to slightly here where we tend to apply as an institute. For example, you are applying from Hinduja or Tata Memorial or TMC Kolkata, even if you are the PI, there the PI is the king in the West. So the PI can actually hire and fire, and they have to manage the funding, and they have to do it on a budget on a year-to-year basis. So it has its pros and cons. It has the advantage that they always have a backup plan. They don't depend on one source only. But then sometimes, unfortunately, they get empowered too. And there is this policy of perish or publish, which actually is sometimes good because you publish a lot of data and a lot of papers, but actually the knowledge is very little, and all of us know the stories that I'm talking about. However, the point I would like to make, which West has done, and we probably should do it in India too, is to engage patient advocacy right in the beginning in the clinical trials. There is a provision of most of the clinical trials, and there is always a patient advocate on the IRB anyway. But we are going different way. Instead of the patient advocate on the ethics committee, we get the patient advocate as a co-investigator. It can be either a one patient advocate or it can be a group. It can be, and we talk about, say, lung cancer, so the lung cancer charity, or brain tumor, which is the brain tumor charity. So, and obviously, again, has to be prominent people. But unfortunately, if I may stick my neck out, in general, the research in the present regimen for the last 10, 15 years of the government has been on the downhill. And I hear it all the time from the directors of IITs. We had recently IIT Kanpur folks coming here to Chennai, and they were lamenting the fact as well, dwindling. It should increase, actually. It is dwindling. So I think as a unanimous whole scientific committee, not only the oncology community, the whole scientific community backed by patient advocates, we have to almost start a revolution, if I may use the word, for the next 5 to 10 years. We owe it to our PhD scholars and our research fellows and hardworking people, and ultimately helps the patient and the science to engage them in the clinical trials so that these things do not happen or happen at a very small rate.
Okay. Okay, so what could be the solutions if you had to do one? Venkat actually spoke about this, doing studies with multiple standards of care, comparing two standards of care, using government and insurance involvement in the standard of care. Now, and I'm to Santam. Santam, do you think we should have some area of oncology which are labeled as studies of public importance or trials of public importance, which should be preferentially funded by the government, and accordingly we could run a collaborative research on them? And do you think, because we're short on time, do you think we need alternative guidelines for investigative initiative research so that we don't have we have a control over the quality, but we don't have so many riders coming in between, that there are so many barriers that most of the people in the institute don't want to do research?
You're correct, Vijay, but I personally think in order for a clinical trial to be robust, it is important that the regulatory process is not diluted. If you have situations where investigator-initiated trials are judged on a different yardstick, the scientific value of that research also gets diluted. So I completely do not agree with the fact that we should have limited regulation. What we need is facilitation of the regulation. Yeah. We need to have a scenario where the clinical trial organization, the funding organization, understands that this kind of regulation is being mandated by the law. So this kind is a required funding that needs to be provided. Compensation has to be provided for, and insurance should be provided from ICMR. As soon as the clinical trial is funded, it should not be the responsibility of the investigator to go hunt for insurance quotes from different places. A central insurance for all clinical trials in India would go a long way in doing this thing. Regarding your the previous question regarding areas of need, I believe already ICMR, DBT regularly come out with calls for proposals which are targeted to areas of need. They ask for proposals in head neck cancer, they ask for proposals in cervical cancer, but unfortunately, it may be my lack of knowledge, but the output of all those years of funding in clinical trials, which has actually made a difference, is nowhere to be seen, I believe.
I would agree with you. Somehow I've always seen that the trials which don't get funded, they do a much better job in terms of output than those trials which get funded.
It has to do with probably the motivation of the
Yeah.
investigator. The
Yeah, agreed,
investigation who is
agreed.
doing the trial without funding is actually
Yeah.
much more motivated
Yeah.
than the investigator who is doing it with funding.
Venkat, your opinion, and then we'll have the last word from Dr. Jalali.
The solutions, I've discussed a lot of them previously, is that the admin and the senior people should understand that it's research which is going to make our people better. And we have to have research in our country and not just copy what is being done in the West, Europe and USA. If they start understanding, and don't penalize people for doing research. Don't say that people who are doing research, they have a lot of time in their hand, they don't see patients, and they're doing for glory of publication. So those are very hurtful things which I as a researchers have to pay. And you see, is it really worth it, after putting all your efforts, still to be told that, this is being just done for personal gains, or, or you don't want to work. Actually, you work more when you're doing research.
Correct. I remember Dr. Jalali's statement, and Dr. Kumar, sir, if he has joined, he always told me that in government institute, research cannot be done between 9 to 5. You have to spend time after 5. You have to spend your time on your weekends. You have to spend your time on public holidays to do research in government institutes. In that, not only government, basically corporate or any institute, you have to, because of the sheer number of patients which we have to focus first on a clinical practice and then shift gears to clinical research. So it actually is an added a lot of burden. I won't just say added, a lot of burden on investigators, and the least thing which we can do is actually not to torment them with this. So final words from you.
I think most of them have been covered quite well. Just a couple of points taken from Venkat. Just to give him some solace, we actually did a small survey. Dr. Cruz led it. We heard that in Tata Hospital, the busiest clinicians had the maximum research output. So it has been shown many times. If you remember, many of you, there was a time in NHS and many other places where there was a constant clinician scientists and they had protected research time. And that project, that model has miserably failed because they were neither doing this nor that, and that didn't work very well. So ultimately, you still have to do clinical practice, but augment the poor guy, the clinician, with the infrastructure, not to have this hassle of compensations, SAEs, IRB proposals, and so on and so forth. And the human resource, I always believe the human resource plays a very important role, not only just the drug, which you can, acquire from other sources. So, my only plea is that these forums have to be done more. One of the things which we don't do very well is to have a unified voice. We have the Indian Cancer Congress, we have this isolated bodies of excellence. There is no unified clinical trial voice because still somehow the research is not taken as brightly or as kind of nicely as one hopes for. So if we do it a collective voice, both within our oncology community first, patient advocates, philanthropy, and the government, and our translation scientists, hopefully as a collective community, which West has also done very elegantly, those are the solutions. And then how to do it, these are the 4 or 5 points that we will be discussing.
With that, I would say thank you to all. We have actually overshot.
Hi, Vijay.
Okay, you are there. Oh,
And I was listening. As I messaged that I got preoccupied with something, but I was listening. I joined in between. So I thought
sorry, I didn't know, sir, you were there.
No issue at all. It's a very nice discussion, and I thought I'll put 1-2 bits of mine, and because it came to solutions. There is one simple one, and simple one is that we can learn from the way health, the way we have our Ayushman scheme kind of things. You get the money. So Ayushman scheme could have been that money goes to the government hospital. They didn't do it that way. They did realize that it doesn't work that way in India. The money is there. Whoever works, it goes there. Now also for research, what happens? Money goes to individual, not necessarily that it has worked or not. It is the socialist mindset, the way it has money gets distributed or resource gets distributed, not to the people necessarily who has done and shown on work to show the research. And we have 30 regional cancer center. The mandate has to be there that if you have a 30 regional cancer center, the money comes from somewhere, and it's the income tax, it's the taxpayer money. There has to be research shown by all these centers. So there are some of those tough decision, but easy to do, but not easy because it's a tough decision. The way it happens in TMH, we get peer reviewed every 5 years for each DMG, showing that what they have done, and then that time you, me, Dr. Jalali is there. He knows the pressure it is there in the whole DMG. What you have done in last 5 years. There was a very good practice of and I wish it gets revived again, and it happens intermittently, that yearly you get reviewed by the director and the group of collegium people. And again, that time, apart from all the things you show, you also show research, and that provides a bit of accountability, and also a bit of a push that those group of people, they are nudged to do that research. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So there are many solutions, and I heard all of them are very nice suggestions given. But a simpler one, which works at one place and which we have seen and experienced that it works.
I don't have anything more to add, so I'll say thank you to all. This was one of the most eminent panelists which we could have. Each one of them is a doyen in their own field.
And Vijay, was my apology. I had to be at a hospital, so I couldn't join. I got late. My apology to everybody.
Each one of them is a doyen in their own field and has done a lot for the patient service, and has done a lot in the individual field of research, which is not only used in nationally but been used globally. With that, I thank Vivek and all the panelists for their thoughts, and it's over to you, Vivek, for the further proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay and all the eminent panelists. It is a wonderful discussion, and